What is the most important ingredient in pizza? Well, that's simple. The answer is yeast. It's yeast. Yeast is the most important question I asked before. Today on episode 7 of Classroom Pizza, we are talking about yeast and why it is so important. I think yeast is the most important ingredient in pizza dough. Counterpoints welcome, but it helps with so much of the flavor and the texture of our dough that without it, we just couldn't have a good quality pizza dough. So let's start with the role of yeast. When yeast eats sugar, alcohol, carbon dioxide, and several forms of acids are created. These byproducts are super important in developing flavor as well as the structure of the overall dough. Remember that gluten network is trapping the carbon dioxide that gets released, so that's what causes our dough to rise. As well, it helps with breaking down some of the proteins and helping to develop the overall structure. Yeast comes in several different forms, and the truth is, there's not a whole lot of difference in our final product between these. So this episode is going to be less hands-on. We're going to focus on active dry yeast, instant yeast, and fresh yeast. First up is instant yeast. The instant doesn't refer to how quickly it rises. Rather, it refers to how quickly the yeast granules get hydrated. So in other words, you can add it at any point of our process of dough or bread making. So it's the easiest to use, plus the overall flavor and quality of the dough is going to be solid. So instant yeast, probably the most accessible, so I would say is probably the most commonly used. Active dry yeast is next up on our list, and it's honestly pretty much the same in terms of the final flavor and how it's going to rise your dough as compared to instant yeast. The only real difference is that in order to use active yeast, you've got to activate it. So this is a process called blooming, where you add water, you add sugar, and you add your yeast, put it to the side, and wait for that yeast to bubble. Once it's ready to go. So the big difference between active and instant is just this extra legwork step. The last of our well-known forms of yeast is called fresh yeast or cake yeast. This is just like the other two. It's going to give you a similar product, similar final flavor, overall structure, texture, etc. The big two downsides to cake yeast is that, one, it's not as easy to find, but two, it's got a much shorter shelf life. So if you're not going to be cooking that week, then you're really not going to be buying it. So it doesn't make as much sense for the home baker who doesn't bake all that often. But wait, I don't wear watches. There's actually another option when it comes to yeast. This is a more complicated topic, and we're going to touch on it later in Classroom Pizza, but I want to mention today sourdough starters. Now, right away, you're probably thinking, okay, I know I've had sourdough bread before, not a fan, not interested. But the truth is, sourdough is a little bit of a misconception. The truth is, sourdough is just a way for us to naturally collect yeast that lives all around us. So we put some water, we put some flour, and we continually feed it, and over time, it's going to develop and find all of these yeast and attract them, and that's going to become the starter of our dough. Make sense? No? Well, I said we're going to cover it later. Now, the cool thing with starters is that you can do all sorts of different types of flours. You can put it near certain types of yeasts. It's a pretty crazy process, and there's a lot that goes into it. So it's definitely not for beginners, but once you get the hang of it, there are so many awesome flavor profiles you can get out of it. Those are all the forms. That's it. See you later. Oh, wait. There's actually a whole other world of options out there. These are called preferments. These are not exactly forms of yeast, but these are ways that we can use yeast to enhance the overall flavor of our pizza dough. Just from the name, you can probably figure out what preferments are. This is a portion of the dough that's fermented before it's incorporated into our final dough. So this might look like taking a portion of flour and a portion of water, adding some of our yeast, and letting that sit for 2 to 3 days before we even incorporate that with the rest of our ingredients. This is going to give it a lot more flavor over time. We will go deeper into preferments later in Classroom Pizza, so today we're just going to mention them so that you can start trying them out on your own. But basically, sourdough starters are first one, and this is, as we mentioned, just a way of cultivating wild yeast. So this is essentially making your own yeast at home. Next, we have what is called a Poolish. A Poolish is basically taking equal parts of water with equal parts of your flour, add your yeast in there, mix it all together, and let that sit for about 2 to 3 days prior to making your pizza dough. When you're ready to assemble it, you're going to add your water into the Poolish, basically dissolve it, and that's going to be the foundation for your pizza dough. Next on our list is an Italian word, the biga. Basically, biga is similar to Poolish. The only difference is the ratio of flour to water. So your Poolish is going to be a lot more watery. It's going to be 50-50, whereas a biga is going to have a higher concentration of flour to water. There are other options, but I'm only going to mention one more. It's a French word I'm not going to try to pronounce, but you might hear it called old dough or prefermented dough or simply preferment. And basically, it's a pretty common technique in pizzerias and bakeries. What happens is you make a dough on Monday. Part of that dough gets taken out, left aside, to incorporate into Tuesday's dough. Tuesday's dough gets a little bit left out, put into Wednesday's dough, and so on and so forth. This just helps to develop the overall flavor, but it's also a pretty cruel tradition. This means that in 10 years, your dough has potentially portions of thousands of pizzas from it. Pretty cool. I'm going to tell you the saddest story you've ever heard. I had an old dough that I was using for about a year, and I was cooking pizza 3 times a week in this year period. So we're talking hundreds of doughs. And after about a year, I'm coming up on the 1-year anniversary of me and this beautiful old dough. And I woke up early. I forget what was happening. I woke up early and I went to make the dough, and scattered, tired brain forgot to take a little bit out. No big deal. It's happened before. Fast forward that evening, and I ended up having to make it a lot later than I thought. So now, other end of the day, still tired, scattered brain, forget to take it out. Make 2 doughs, and I lost it. My old dough was gone, but damn was it good. So there you have it. Instant yeast, active dry yeast, fresh yeast, sourdough starter. 4 different forms of yeast. Pre-ferments include the biga, the Poolish, the old dough. 3 different ways that you can enhance those flavors. There are others. We'll talk about them later. Your homework this week is more like a test. I want you to try to use all of the knowledge that we've gained so far in 7 weeks of Classroom Pizza to tweak our pizza dough recipe. So try a new hydration level. Try to use sugar instead of honey. Try anything different, and then come back and leave a comment and let me know how it went and what you changed. That's going to do it for episode 7 of Classroom Pizza. Thanks for stopping by, and I wanted to remind you that every Saturday you can get more class with the After Class podcast, where we go deeper into the topics and answer your burning questions. I hope to see you there.